Arriving in West Virginia tonight, President Trump resorted to the familiar line that he's trotted out since the indictment of his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, last year.
This has nothing to do with Russian collusion. This started as Russian collusion. This has absolutely nothing to do. This is a witch hunt, and it's a disgrace.
In any event, Manafort is now a convicted felon and seems headed to prison for a number of years on tax and bank fraud crimes. But on the biggest news, Trump said nothing.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, what about Michael Cohen? Any comment on Michael Cohen?
Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer and so-called fixer, is also, as of today, a convicted felon.
How are you?
Cohen arrived at a New York court earlier to plead guilty to a number of charges involving tax evasion, but also most notably to 2 felonies involving illegal campaign contributions.
What he did was he worked to pay money to silence 2 women who had information that he believed would be detrimental to the 2016 campaign and to the candidate and the campaign.
The candidate he's talking about is undoubtedly Donald Trump. And the money is the hush money paid to former adult film star Stormy Daniels and to Playboy model Karen McDougal to keep them from telling their stories about their affairs with Trump. In the case of the Daniels money, Trump said months ago that he didn't pay it and knew nothing about it.
Well, you have to ask Michael Cohen. Michael's my attorney, and you'll have to ask Michael.
Do you know where he got the money to make that payment?
No, I don't know.
But Cohen told the court the candidate, whom we know is Trump, not only knew about the payment to Daniels, but directed him to make it, coordinated the payment, and then paid Cohen back.
Wow. Wow.
At his rally tonight, Trump took comfort in the devotion of his most loyal supporters.
And Keith Bogue joins us now. So, Keith, take us through what the damage here is to the president going forward.
Well, first of all, the Manafort convictions are no longer just hypothetical. They're a reality. And since that trial was always about putting pressure on Manafort to cooperate with Robert Mueller's investigation, he's now under huge pressure to decide whether he's going to flip and cooperate with the investigation. His lawyer left the courtroom today pointedly saying that Manafort will now consider all his options.
Right, but the impact of the Cohen guilty plea seems for the moment perhaps more serious for Donald Trump.
Yeah, Michael Cohen has clearly implicated the president in serious crimes. 2 knowing and deliberate campaign finance violations and attempts to cover them up. The reason Trump wasn't named seems to be that he wasn't charged. And the reason he wasn't charged is because he is the president, and the Justice Department policy is that a sitting president can't be indicted. But the political price could still be enormous.
Keith Bogue in Washington, thanks very much.
Thank you.
With those remarkable developments today, Cohen and Manafort join a growing list of people tied to Trump who are in legal trouble. 3 have already pleaded guilty to crimes. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn admitted he lied to the FBI. Rick Gates, Trump's former deputy campaign manager, pleaded guilty to conspiracy against the U.S. And George Papadopoulos, described as a low-level Trump advisor, made false statements to the FBI about his contacts with Russians during the campaign. Then there's Michael Cohen today. And Paul Manafort's case does stand out because he was found guilty. He didn't admit guilt. It's also worth pointing out there's no hard evidence that Donald Trump himself committed a crime, but the whirlwind of legal proceedings is closer to the president now than ever before. Now, let's bring in Seth Waxman, a former U.S. federal prosecutor. He's in Washington tonight. So let's begin with those payments. I mean, Cohen's lawyer said if those payments were a crime for Michael Cohen, then why wouldn't they be a crime for Donald Trump? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they very well could be. Under the law in the United States, there's something called a co-conspirator, and that's what's alleged in these pleadings and court documents that were filed. Mr. Cohen obviously pleading guilty to the events and identifying candidate A, obviously Mr. Trump, and tit for tat would apply, and he, the president, could be also criminally liable under these circumstances.
And as I've been tracking the conversation around this outcome, I mean, you tweeted that this was a defining moment for the investigation and maybe even the country's history. Why is that?
Well, you have two key players in this investigation. One, Mr. Cohen, having pled guilty, and Mr. Manafort having been found guilty. And if one or both of those individuals end up cooperating with law enforcement, with Mr. Mueller and the rest of the investigation, those could be breakthrough moments for the Mueller investigation as a whole. For example, giving someone on the inside of that infamous Trump Tower meeting in June of 2016. That can be incredibly valuable evidence and could put the Mueller investigation on the doorstep to the President of the United States.
Right. So walk me through the next steps. I mean, what happens now?
Well, there's a lot of X factors here in the States right now. I mean, one of the things that's never come up is a sitting president pardoning people that have information potentially against him. If that were to occur, you'd have a whole road we'd go down of whether that could be considered obstruction of justice. But the main thing that we're going to be looking for is to see whether Mr. Cohen or Mr. Manafort end up cooperating. If that happens, like I said, that's a big moment. You'd expect that the D.C. trial against Mr. Manafort would go away, and we may or may not learn a lot about what Mr. Cohen's doing behind closed doors, but it's clearly a defining moment in this investigation.
Seth Waxman, good to get your insights. Thanks for this.
Thank you.
And today we heard from a woman who is also one of Trump's trusted few until she was fired as a White House advisor. Omarosa Manigault-Newman told NBC's Hardball she thinks we're witnessing a tipping point.
I will say that today changed everything. This is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump.
Why?
Because he knows that the person who knows everything about him, about his relationships with these women and others that people may not know about, are going to come to light.
The former reality TV star also released phone video of Michael Cohen boarding Trump's campaign plane in September 2016. She says it proves Cohen was part of that campaign despite his denials.